Coming up in our newscast tonight. The two Koreas hold a groundbreaking ceremony for an inter-Korean rail and road project. The symbolic event was attended by participants from both sides, as well as officials from several other nations and the UN, who saw how connecting the transport network could bring tremendous benefits across Asia and Europe. South Korea's central bank plans to keep next year's annual inflation target at 2%, but contrary to its usual changes made every 3 years, the BOK is maintaining the same level from 2016. The mercury is expected to plummet all the way down to minus 12 degrees Celsius in the capital, but the wind chill factor is expected to make the cold even more unbearable. These conditions won't be short-lived as they are expected to continue through the weekend. News Center begins now. It's 8 p.m. here in Korea, live from our studio in Seoul. This is Arirang News Center. Welcome to our program. I'm Daniel Chang. As agreed at the Inter-Korean summits this year, Seoul and Pyeongyang held a groundbreaking ceremony for their joint railway and road projects today. High-ranking government figures not just from the two sides, but China, Russia, and Mongolia, and even a top UN official dealing with economic cooperation were there to mark the occasion. Woo Jung-hee starts us off with this symbolic event.
Seoul's transport minister and Pyongyang's vice railway minister stand shoulder to shoulder, writing messages of hope and commemoration on a railway tie, peace and prosperity together, connecting railways and roads together. This was the scene Wednesday at the North's Panmun station at the two Koreas' groundbreaking ceremony for linking and modernizing their railways and roads. There were 100 participants from each side, mainly comprising key officials in charge of transport and inter-Korean affairs. From the south, the top officials were Seoul's transport and unification ministers, Kim Hyun-mi and Jo Myung-kyun, and from North Korea, Lee Sun-kwon, the head of Pyongyang's reunification committee.
The arteries connecting South and North will become arteries for co-prosperity in Northeast Asia and will expand our economic reach to the continent. The Trans-Eurasian Railway and the Asian Highway will reduce the time and cost spent on logistics and thereby raise the competitiveness of our companies. The economic benefits will be enjoyed by both Koreas.
Today's groundbreaking ceremony will be a historic event that creates new engine for not only balanced economic development on the Korean peninsula, but also for the co-prosperity of Eurasia and the whole world.
Also at the ceremony was the executive secretary of the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, as well as some senior railway and road officials from Russia, China, and Mongolia. They expressed determination to cooperate in forming a Eurasian rail network.
There are trains running from Pyongyang to Beijing. If the tracks are connected between Seoul and Pyongyang, then it will be possible to go to Beijing from Seoul by train. I hope that day comes soon.
The officials from Seoul and Pyongyang took part in a couple of commemorative events, like track linking, leaving their signatures on a railway tie, and unveiling a road sign pointing towards the South and North Korean capitals. But these symbolic acts do not mean that the two Koreas will start construction right away. Things will have to go in tandem with North Korea's denuclearization, and they'll have to get sanctions waivers from the UN Security Council for whatever work they do in the future. South Korea says the actual construction work can begin once conditions are in place internationally. Woo Jung-hee, Arirang News.
Moving on to other stories now, Washington will continue putting economic and political pressure on North Korea to persuade the regime to give up its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Voice of America reported Wednesday that the State Department's strategy report on East Asia and the Pacific shows the government is working to achieve Pyongyang's complete and verifiable denuclearization through negotiations. The report named the communist state's nuclear program as one of the top issues to be resolved together with the regional players, and that sanctions will be maintained until the Hermit Kingdom fully gives up its nukes. While that is the ultimate goal, the report emphasized the short-term goal is to First, freeze North Korea's nuclear development, stop the production of fissile material, and form an action plan for the early steps of denuclearization. Nuclear negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington are ongoing. That's coming from Seoul's foreign minister in a recent interview during a time when many expressed concerns over slow progress in the talks. The top diplomat pointed out the two sides are discussing dates for high-level meetings. Kang has the full story.
South Korean Foreign Minister Kang says that North Korea and the U.S. remain fully committed to dialogue and that the two sides are continuing their denuclearization talks. In an interview with local news outlet Hankyoreh, Kang said Pyongyang and Washington are discussing possible dates for their next high-level talks. She emphasized the need for the meeting to include guarantees for the two sides and define what those guarantees should be. One crucial issue is what guarantees the U.S. will offer when North Korea shuts down its Yongbyon nuclear complex, which would be a big concession from the regime. The two countries also feel the need for a second summit between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump. But according to Kang, there's great uncertainty on whether it will take place in January or February next year as hoped. And last week, the U.S. Special Representative to North Korea, Stephen Biegun, made some conciliatory gestures to the North during his visit to Seoul. He said the U.S. will review allowing its citizens to visit the North for humanitarian purposes and consider sending humanitarian aid worth $8 million to the country. Kang said it will be a big step forward if the regime responds to those gestures, which is why attention now turns to Kim Jong-un's New Year's address. As for the sanctions on the North, Kang said Seoul and Washington will need to coordinate closely on the appropriate time to lift the sanctions. Of course, it will depend on how much progress is made on the irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. There will also need to be similar discussions at the UN Security Council. Kang, Arirang News.
The nation's central bank is maintaining its inflation target unchanged at 2%. The BOK has been setting new targets every 3 years since 2004, but starting next year, it will remain at 2% flat without a specified timetable. Ko Ryuni explains further.
In the new year, South Korea's central bank is going to keep its inflation target at 2%, where it's been since 2016. The Bank of Korea's inflation target is set based on the year-on-year changes in the consumer price index. According to officials on Wednesday, the 2% target is not only considered the optimal rate of inflation for the South Korean economy, but is also on par with many of the world's other major central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve. The BOK also pointed out that it did not specify an exact timeline this time, because inflation has been steady over the last 10 years like in other advanced countries. For instance, South Korea's consumer price index rose 2% on year in November, on par with the central bank's target for the second month in a row. To better communicate with the public about the inflation target, the BOK plans to release reports about how it is implementing related policies and hold press conferences twice a year. The announcement came as part of the central bank's monetary policy for 2019. It said it plans to keep its accommodative policy, meaning generally lower interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, which encourages spending, investment, and growth. During this process, the BOK aims to monitor the possibility of financial imbalances due to household debt and external uncertainties such as the U.S.-China trade conflict. When talking about economic growth overall, the central bank expects it will be driven mainly by exports and private consumption, thanks to the growing global economy and the government's active fiscal spending. Ko Ryuni, Arirang News.
Asian stocks retreated today. Some of them were already dealt a heavy blow earlier this week following big declines in the U.S. and other major countries on Christmas Eve, mainly due to fears of a global economic slowdown in 2019. Here's Kim Ji-yeon with a breakdown of the digits.
South Korea's benchmark Kospi dipped to an almost 2-month low, falling by more than 1% to close at 2,028 on Wednesday, only about 30 points above the psychologically important 2009. Meanwhile, the tech-heavy Kospi dropped by more than 1/6% to close at around 666. The Minister of Economy and Finance held an emergency meeting with officials of the Bank of Korea and other relevant agencies to monitor markets and discuss possible countermeasures after major markets around the globe witnessed one of the worst Christmas seasons on record. Japan's Nikkei, which dipped below the 20,000 mark for the first time in 15 months the previous day, ended with a gain of less than 1% on Wednesday. MSCI's broadest index of Asia-Pacific shares outside Japan slipped by 2%, while the Shanghai Composite Index lost 0.3%. The Dow Jones, S&P 500, and the Nasdaq all shed more than 2% on Monday, eroding investor confidence following the U.S. partial government shutdown and President Donald Trump's attacks on the Federal Reserve. President Trump on Tuesday furthered his criticism of the Fed, saying the central bank was hiking interest rates too quickly. Investors were also grappling with news U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin had called up top U.S. bankers, making plans to convene a plunge protection team. This ignited investor fears of a global economic slowdown. Already, the International Monetary Fund has downgraded its 2019 growth forecast for the global economy to 3.7% in October from the previous 3.9% in July. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Seoul's government will extend the grace period for implementing the shortened 52-hour cap on weekly working hours. That's coming from the nation's finance chief during today's meeting. Hong Nam-gi explained the transitional period, which was to expire by the year's end, will continue until a consensus in the National Assembly is reached on how to adjust the planned flexible work hour, a system which limits the maximum weekly work hours over a 3-month period. Initially, starting next year, employers of companies with 300 or more workers that violate the weekly cap would have faced up to 2 years in jail or fines of more than 17,000 US dollars. President Moon Jae-in spoke to his economic advisors today. He mentioned the government is looking into new economic policies to try and boost growth. Manufacturing has long been the main engine, and what the sector needs now is innovation. Hwang Ho-jun shares with us his remarks.
According to the South Korean president, the nation's economy desperately needs a jumpstart, and the key to it is industrial innovation.
우리의 전통 주력 제조 산업을 혁신해서 고도화하고 그걸 통해서 또 경쟁력을 높여 나가는 것도 대단히 절실하고, 또 앞으로 우리 미래의 성장 동력을 마련하기 위해서 우리 경제를 혁신해 나가는 것도 또 대단히 절실한 그런 과제입니다.
President Moon Jae-in was speaking Wednesday afternoon in a general meeting of the National Economic Advisory Council. According to the Blue House, the objective of the meeting was for the president, along with his economic advisors and ministers, to discuss and take a closer look at the economic policy direction for the new year.
오늘 우리 대한민국 경제 지금 요즘 침체, 부진 뭐 이런 이야기를 많이 듣고, 심지어는 좀 미래가 잘 보이지 않는다, 이런 이제 우려들도 있는데, 오늘 대한민국 경제가 다시 활기를 되찾고 미래를 향해서 열심히 달려갈 수 있는 그런 이제 좋은 논의들이 이루어지기를 바랍니다.
Presidential Economic Advisor Kim Yeon-chul, who visited the Blue House Press Center after the meeting, said the council called for mid to long-term strategies to bring about industrial innovation that can overcome the current difficulties and secure future growth engines. Several tasks for the government were proposed during the meeting: investing in people, establishing future-oriented relations between labor and management, narrowing the focus of core technologies, actively pursuing regulatory reform, and cultivating an environment friendly for entrepreneurship. The council also suggested creating an active communication channel between the government and industries, academia, and labor. Instead of using and upgrading existing technologies, the South Korean president insisted that it's time for a new economic model, innovation which would create new value and enable the country to take the lead in global industry. Hwang Ho-jun, Arirang News.
Prosecutors raided the nation's top office this morning as part of an investigation into claims that the Cheongwade illegally collected information about civilians. The seize and search warrant was in response to a criminal complaint filed by the main opposition Liberty Korea Party against top presidential officials, including Chief of Staff Im Jong-seok and Secretary for Civil Affairs Cho Guk, accusing them of power abuse and dereliction of duty. The accusations are based on a confession from Kim Tae-woo, a special inspector from the prosecution, who claims to have had illegally surveyed many civilians. Cheongwade denies all the allegations. The presidential office grounds are a restricted area, so the investigators are not allowed to physically enter. But the top office spokesman said Cheongwade cooperated fully under related procedures, voluntarily submitting materials that the prosecution requested, including desktop computers. South Korea has long been troubled by falling birth rate, and the number continues to decline in October. There's been a series of measures implemented to solve the problem, but they clearly weren't very effective. For details, let's turn to our Seoul-Tokyo.
It seems that measures to reverse South Korea's low birth rate are having little impact. According to Statistics Korea on Wednesday, the number of births in October this year stood at 26,500, down 5% compared to last year. It's the 8th month this year that the number of births has been under 30,000, with only January and March seeing more than 30,000 newborns. Birth figures often compared to the same month in previous years to account for seasonal variations, and for the last 31 months in a row, there have been fewer births in Korea than in the same month the previous year. If there are no major changes in the trend, the government predicts that the only 330,000 babies will be born this year. The number of births fell below 400,000 last year for the first time since the figure was first recorded in 1981. Statistics Korea says the falling number of births can be largely attributed to the steadily falling marriage rate. In fact, according to a national survey in November, the percentage of Koreans who think people should get married has dropped below 50% for the first time. The marriage rate has been showing a steady decline since 1990, and the number of marriages in 2017 was the lowest ever in Korea. Seoul-Tokyo, Arirang News.
Over in Thailand, search operations are ongoing for two elderly Koreans that drowned in the Nan River, which runs through a golf course. This is the second day that more than 100 rescuers, including some divers to help bring the Thai cave boys out to safety, are searching for the missing people. But the fast flux of the river is hampering the operation. The two went missing when they fell into the river after their golf carts collided. Immediately after the accident, the Korean embassy in Thailand dispatched consular personnel to the scene and asked the local police for a prompt rescue and thorough investigation. The Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and the atmosphere of reconciliation between South and North Korea at the Games was selected as one of AFP's top 10 sporting highlights of 2018. The news agency put the Winter Olympics in 8th spot on their list, saying the event in February led to a thaw in ties with nuclear-armed North Korea. The two sides marched together behind the unification flag and took part in the Winter Olympics as a joint team for the first time in the history of the global event. Pyeongchang wasn't the only Korean sports highlight of the year. The Associated Press listed the South Korean men's national football team upsetting defending champs Germany and knocking them out of the Russian World Cup as one of the biggest surprises of 2018. If you're in Korea, brace yourself for freezing conditions tomorrow. Temperatures will plummet down into the negative double digits in the capital, all the way to minus 12 degrees Celsius. But with a wind chill, it's going to feel more like minus 20. The southern cities of Busan and Gwangju will also experience sub-zero conditions. Bundle up with more layers or avoid going outside on Friday. The mercury will dip even further and the cold wave is likely to continue into the weekend. Weather agencies say it's an Arctic wind that's bringing the cold wave. Some areas will also get snow Thursday night through Friday morning. We continue a look back at 2018. South Korea-Japan ties took a drastic turn near the end of the year following Seoul's decision on compensation for Koreans forced to hard labor by Japanese firms during the war and the dissolution of a foundation for victims of wartime sex slavery. Our Park Hee-jun zooms in on where bilateral ties stand as we head towards 2019.
In the short span of 2 months, Seoul Supreme Court ruled that 2 Japanese companies must compensate South Korean victims for unpaid work during Japan's colonial rule of Korea. It said the 1965 treaty that normalized diplomatic ties with Japan did not abrogate the right of individuals to seek reparations. So the victims got their victory after a decades-long fight. And so did the women forced to sexually serve Japanese troops during World War II. On November 21st, the South Korean government announced that it will begin legal procedures to dissolve the Reconciliation and Healing Foundation or the so-called Comfort Women Foundation. The decision was not unexpected because the foundation, funded by Japan, was controversial from the very start. Tokyo claims it's done enough over the years to completely settle the issue of the Comfort Women, but critics say its actions do not reflect the wishes of the victims, nor have they come with a sincere apology. President Moon Jae-in also made clear his opposition to the agreement that set up the foundation. Both issues sparked immediate protests from Japan. Japan has been demanding that the South Korean government overrule the court's decision on the forced labor payments. Prime Minister Abe also stepped in to condemn the shutdown of the Comfort Women Foundation, calling for Seoul to act responsibly. The two sides are working to build mutual understanding on the issues, as shown through the phone conversation between their foreign ministers and the meeting between officials in Seoul earlier this week. But it will take many more months for the foundation to be completely dissolved, the biggest question being what to do with the remaining $5 million in funding sent by Tokyo. When it comes to the women who were sexually enslaved, the South Korean government plans to turn to the victims themselves to find an appropriate way forward and to negotiate on those measures with Japan. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
And now let's turn our focus to the stories coming from outside the nation that turned heads this year. From heat waves to hurricanes, extreme weather made headlines around the globe. Seo Bo-bin sheds light on the range of destructive anomalies.
This summer was said to be the fourth hottest on record, raising alarms over the future of our planet. Experts have also warned that heat waves across the world could grow more frequent and intense in the years to come. From the US and Canada to Norway and Japan, the Northern Hemisphere has seen record-breaking temperatures and extreme heat waves in the summer month. In the US, excessive heat warnings were issued, and Denver and Los Angeles both hit their all-time highest temperature of 42 degrees Celsius. The extreme weather in California also led to deadly wildfires, including Camp Fire, which has been described as the state's most destructive and third deadliest wildfire in history after it left towns and homes in ruins. Asia also suffered from heat waves, and in some areas of Japan, the temperature hit 40 degrees Celsius in July. And after the heat waves, there were a series of powerful hurricanes and typhoons. In October, Hurricane Michael plowed through the southeastern United States after making landfall in Florida. Michael was the most powerful hurricane on record to ever make a landfall on the Florida Panhandle. In Japan, when Typhoon Jebi hit Osaka in early September, thousands of people were stranded and had to be evacuated from Kansai International Airport after a ship collided with the bridge connecting the airport to the mainland. Scientists say there could be even more extreme weather in the future, with the World Meteorological Organization predicting that the number of heatwave days could double by 2020 and quadruple by 2040. Seo Bo-bin, Arirang News.
Time to turn to Michelle Bach for the updates you need. Michelle, more locations nationwide have been issued cold wave alerts.
Yes, Daniel. Now, besides the southernmost regions, most of the nation are under cold wave advisories. While the northern areas of Gangwon-do and also Gyeonggi-do provinces have been issued warnings. Now, this means temperatures in these areas are expected to plunge at least some 15 degrees Celsius from today's readings. Now, Seoul will start the day at minus 12 degrees Celsius tomorrow, but it will feel much colder at minus 20 degrees due to the wind chill factor. Now, the freezing conditions are caused by an Arctic cold front that will affect the peninsula until Friday. And the neighboring countries will also shiver under temperatures some 7 degrees lower than today's readings, but except for Tokyo. Now, going over to our temperature readings in details, now Seoul will drop down to minus 12 degrees Celsius. Chuncheon is colder at minus 14 degrees. And cloudless conditions will raise up the mercury a bit over in Seoul to minus 6 degrees, while Daegu and Gyeongju reaches down to 0 and 1 degrees respectively. Now, with the exception of Jeollado provinces and Jeju Island, most places are expected to stay clear of precipitation for now. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That's all we have for you in tonight's edition of Arirang News Center. As always, thanks for staying with us.